I've been driving a taxi in this soulless city for over 5 years now. It's a big city, sure, but that doesn't make it alive. It's like one of those old, hollow shells you find washed up on the beach. All grandeur on the outside, but empty inside. The streets are vast and lined with looming buildings, yet they feel vacant, like a stage set up for some play that never took place. I've spent countless nights winding through its dark avenues, its forgotten back streets, and its dismal corners. Some say you get used to the darkness. I'm not so sure. Working the night shift has become a routine, the kind that grinds away at your soul slowly, like sandpaper on wood. I've grown accustomed to the strange passengers, the fleeting conversations that vanish into the void as soon as they're over. My cab becomes their confessional booth. I'm their silent priest, hearing secrets, lies, laughter, and fear. But tonight, something felt different. The air carried a certain weight, an eerie chill that seeped through the car windows as I cruised through the empty streets. It was around 11 p.m., and I was waiting for my first fare of the night. I always start my shifts with a quick stop at my usual coffee stand, a little joint tucked away on the corner of Elm Street. It's become a sort of ritual, a cup of black coffee to kickstart the night. I sipped it slowly, letting the warmth fill me up as I watched the fog begin to drift in, curling around the streetlights and swallowing the outlines of distant buildings. Finally, my phone beeped, the notification for a new fare lighting up the screen. I squinted at the address, some office building about a 10-minute drive away. "Here we go," I muttered, tossing the empty cup into the trash before getting into the driver's seat. As I navigated through the city streets, I couldn't shake off the strange feeling that tonight was going to be different. The fog grew denser as I drove, blurring the edges of everything around me, creating a world where shapes and shadows mingled. When I arrived at the pickup point, a middle-aged man stood on the curb, impeccably dressed in a crisp suit and tie. He looked out of place here, like he belonged to a different era, a different city. I glanced at him through the passenger window, noting the sharpness of his attire. "Evening," I greeted him as he climbed into the back seat. He didn't respond immediately, just nodded slightly and settled in. His silence was unnerving, but I've had my share of quiet fares, so I didn't think much of it. "Where to?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Archer Street, the old part of town," he said, his voice smooth yet hollow, like an echo in an empty hallway. I raised an eyebrow. That part of the city was practically deserted, especially this late at night, but it wasn't my business to ask questions. "All right," I replied, putting the car into drive and pulling away from the curb. The fog seemed to thicken as we moved through the streets, the city lights dimming until they were nothing more than a soft, hazy glow. We drove in silence for a while. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on the drive and ignore the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. Every now and then, I'd steal a glance in the rearview mirror, checking on the passenger. He sat there, unnervingly still, staring out the window with his face half hidden in the shadows. We reached a red light. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for it to change. It was then that I glanced into the rearview mirror again, and my heart skipped a beat. The man was smiling, but not just any smile. It was an unnatural, grotesque stretch of the lips that spread wider and wider, until it looked like his face might split in two. I snapped my head around to look directly at him, my mouth opening to say something, but the words died on my tongue. The smile was gone. He sat there, expressionless, his gaze still fixed on the window. "Are you all right?" he asked suddenly, his voice calm and mocking. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed, forcing a laugh that came out strained. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit tired," I replied, turning back to face the road. I could feel my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the wheel tighter. I hit the gas as soon as the light turned green, my eyes darting nervously to the mirror every few seconds. But the man's face remained blank, emotionless, as though nothing strange had happened. We arrived at his destination, a quiet, dimly lit street in the old part of town. I slowed the car to a stop, taking in the sight of rundown buildings and shuttered windows. The place had an abandoned, forgotten feel to it. Why would a man like him want to be here? "Take care now," he said softly, almost mockingly, as he opened the door and stepped out. He paused for a moment, looking back at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Then he walked off into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, staring at his retreating figure until it disappeared into the fog. My hands felt clammy against the steering wheel. I have seen my share of odd passengers, but something about this one left a mark, like an ink blot on the back of my mind that wouldn't fade. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. "Just another passenger," I muttered to myself, putting the car in drive. Just as I was about to leave, my phone buzzed, signaling another fare request. I glanced at the screen. It was close by. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to leave this part of the city. But business was business, and there weren't many drivers around here, especially at this hour. I accepted the fare and began driving toward the pickup location. The fog was thicker now, swirling around the car like a living thing, its tendrils stretching out and wrapping around the lampposts. As I approached the pickup area, I spotted a figure standing beneath a dim streetlight. Their outline was barely visible in the mist. I slowed the car to a stop beside the person, but something felt off. I couldn't make out their face or any features for that matter. It was as if the darkness around them swallowed the details. The person stood there for a moment before turning and walking away into an alley, never once acknowledging the taxi. "What the?" I muttered, my eyes squinting to follow the figure. Maybe it wasn't the client? I glanced around, searching for any sign of another passenger, but the street was empty. There was no one else in sight. I checked my phone again. The app showed I was in the correct location, but no one had approached. I waited for a few more minutes, glancing nervously at the alleyway where the figure had disappeared. Still nothing. A strange feeling gnawed at my stomach, telling me to leave. "Forget this," I muttered under my breath, pulling away from the curb. The fog swallowed the headlights as I navigated back onto the main road, my heart thumping louder than before. As I drove, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, at the end of the street, stood a figure, silent, still, staring at my car. I opened the window, calling out, "Did you order a taxi?" No response. The figure turned slowly and walked away, just like before. "All right, this is getting weird," I muttered, an edge of fear creeping into my voice. I hit the gas, not wanting to stick around to see if this shadow would appear again. I glanced at the rearview mirror as I passed through the intersection, half expecting to see the figure one more time. And there it was, or what looked like the same person. Same posture, standing motionless as I sped away. I didn't stop this time. I just wanted to get out of this area and into the more familiar parts of the city. A few minutes later, I found myself in a somewhat livelier part of town. The fog had thinned out, the streetlights casting a more comforting glow. I pulled over next to a small coffee stand, needing something to settle my nerves. The warmth of the coffee seeped into my hands, grounding me for a moment. I sipped it, standing by my car, trying to rationalize what had just happened. It had to be the fog playing tricks on me. That, combined with the shadows and the late hour, it was messing with my mind. "Get a grip," I muttered, finishing the last of the coffee and tossing the cup into a nearby trash can. I needed another fare, something to take my mind off these unsettling encounters. I got back into the car, checked my phone, and accepted the next request. This time it was fairly close by. Maybe a normal passenger would ease my nerves. I drove through the slightly more illuminated streets toward the new pickup location. The city's vibe was different here, but that sense of unease clung to me like a thick fog. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that same figure standing motionless behind me, but nothing appeared. The pickup spot was just a few blocks away, a small intersection where the road dipped into a tunnel. I arrived and idled at the curb, looking around for any sign of my fare. After a few moments, a man emerged from the shadows of the tunnel. He walked calmly toward the taxi, his figure gradually coming into focus under the streetlights. My muscles tensed as he approached, but I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw his face. He looked relatively normal, probably in his mid-30s, wearing an old jacket and carrying a bag slung over his shoulder. He opened the rear door and got in, nodding as a greeting. "Thanks for stopping. I need to get to the old house on the outskirts of town," he said in a deep, monotone voice. "An old house?" My instincts flared up. "The outskirts?" I repeated, turning to look at him. "You sure you want to go there? It's pretty deserted at this hour." "Yeah," he replied. His eyes locked onto mine in the rearview mirror. There was an intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm sure. It's where I need to go." I nodded, trying to suppress the unease bubbling up inside me. "All right then," I muttered, and put the car into gear. We drove off, leaving the more populated part of the city behind. The road stretched out in front of us, long and winding. Streetlights grew sparse, replaced by shadows cast by the twisted branches of old trees lining the road. The city slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, and a deep sense of isolation set in. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to glance back at the passenger, who remained eerily quiet. Minutes passed, and an oppressive silence filled the car. I turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the quiet with some white noise. Static crackled through the speakers, a harsh reminder of how far from civilization we had driven. I switched it off, regretting the decision almost immediately. The silence returned, now heavier, pressing in on all sides. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a faint glow coming from the direction of my passenger. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, his phone, the screen casting a dim light on his face. He wasn't looking at it, though. Instead, his eyes were fixed straight ahead, his face blank, almost expressionless. An involuntary shudder went through me. "So what brings you out here this late?" I asked, trying to break the silence. My voice sounded strained, even to me. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the movement slow and deliberate. "Business," he finally answered, his voice hollow, devoid of emotion. I nodded, focusing back on the road. A few more minutes passed in that unnerving quiet. Then, just as we approached a narrow tree-lined lane leading deeper into the outskirts, the house came into view. It loomed in the darkness, an old abandoned structure with a sagging roof and broken windows. But the strangest thing was the porch light. It flickered on and off, casting long, warped shadows across the ground. I knew this area well, and there was no electricity out here. The sight made my skin crawl. The car slowed as I pulled up in front of the house. My passenger stared at it, unblinking. "This is it," he said softly, finally breaking his silence. He got out of the car, but before closing the door, he turned back toward me. "Wait here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I won't be long." I wanted to refuse, to drive away and leave him here with whatever madness this place held. But something in his eyes held me captive. I nodded reluctantly, and he shut the door, walking toward the house. I watched him disappear into the shadows on the porch. As I sat there, a strange sensation washed over me. It felt as if the darkness around the house was alive, pressing in on the car, squeezing the air out of my lungs. My hand instinctively reached for the radio, but I stopped myself. No static was going to make this feeling go away. Minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. My heart pounded louder with each passing second. The porch light flickered again, and I glanced toward the house, hoping to see my passenger returning. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A faint glow appeared in one of the upstairs windows, and then a silhouette. It was the passenger. He stood there, staring down at the car, his face obscured by the shadows. How did he get up there so fast? And why was he just staring? All right, enough of this, I muttered to myself. I leaned out of the window and yelled, "Hey, come on, let's go." My voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no response. He just continued to stare, unmoving. A part of me screamed to leave, but I couldn't just abandon him here in this godforsaken place. I sighed, grabbing the flashlight from the glove compartment. "All right, just a quick check," I muttered, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. I got out of the car, the door creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. The porch groaned under my weight as I stepped up to the entrance. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing a dark, musty hallway beyond. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and pushed the door open with a shaky hand. "Hello?" My voice echoed into the silence, disappearing into the dark corridors of the house. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I took a step forward. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of decay and neglect. As I moved cautiously through the hallway, the beam of my flashlight scanned the dust-covered surfaces. It caught the edge of a small round table in the corner. On it lay an old, yellowed newspaper. I stepped closer, the light illuminating the paper's front page. My heart skipped a beat. There, printed clearly, was the face of my passenger. His photo stared back at me, framed by the headline, "Local man found dead in abandoned house." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How was this possible? I had just driven this man here. He was alive. Or at least I thought he was. A chill ran down my spine, making the hair on my arms stand up. I scanned the dimly lit room, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me with that unnerving stare. But there was no one, just darkness pressing in from all sides. "I need to get out of here," I whispered to myself, feeling a surge of panic well up inside. I turned on my heel and ran toward the front door, not daring to look back. The floor creaked under my hurried steps, echoing through the emptiness of the house. I burst out onto the porch, gasping for breath, and made a beeline for the car. The moment I slammed the door shut and locked it, a slight wave of relief washed over me. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. "Just get the hell out of here," I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Then, out of nowhere, I sensed it, that familiar, eerie presence in the car. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror. And there he was. My passenger sat in the back seat, his form slumped and decayed, his eyes hollow and sunken. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his clothes appeared tattered. A feeling of nausea washed over me as I stared in horror at what had become of him. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. Then, slowly, his lips parted, and he whispered in a voice that sent shivers down my spine, "Take me home." I blinked, my body frozen with fear. Before I could react, his form began to dissolve, his body breaking apart into a thick, swirling cloud of black smoke. The smoke filled the car, enveloping me in its suffocating embrace. I coughed and fumbled for the door handle, nearly tearing it off in my panic as I stumbled out of the vehicle. The cold night air hit me like a shock as I fell to my knees, coughing and gasping. The fog outside seemed to grow thicker, pressing in from all directions. I glanced back at the car, half expecting to see the smoke spilling out, but there was nothing. Just the empty interior staring back at me. My pulse was racing and I could barely think. I staggered back toward the porch of the house, seeking some sense of refuge. I collapsed onto the porch steps, my body trembling from the encounter. As I steadied my breathing, something caught my eye. There, lying on the wooden steps, was another newspaper. My stomach churned as I reached out with a shaky hand to pick it up. The front page stared back at me, and my heart sank into the pit of my stomach. This time it wasn't the face of my passenger, it was mine. The headline read, "Local taxi driver disappears after strange incident." I dropped the newspaper, my hands going numb. My vision swam as a wave of terror washed over me. No, this can't be happening, I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it all. Was this some sort of twisted joke, a hallucination? I felt the world closing in around me, the fog growing thicker and darker, almost suffocating. The quietness of the surroundings became deafening, filled with an unspoken threat. I staggered to my feet, my heart pounding. I have to leave, I muttered to myself. I have to get out of here. I turned and stumbled down the porch steps, my legs feeling like lead. I glanced toward the car, but a part of me hesitated. The thought of going back inside, of sitting in that driver's seat again with who knows what possibly appearing in the back seat, filled me with dread. But as I took a step toward the car, I felt a shift in the air, a coldness brushing against the back of my neck. I turned around slowly, my pulse racing, expecting to see him standing there again. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent outline of the house against the foggy backdrop. My eyes darted to the newspaper on the porch, the image of my face glaring back at me in the dim light. A sense of inevitability washed over me, a feeling that no matter what I did, I couldn't outrun this. I forced myself to look away and made a break for the car, not caring about the consequences anymore. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and this nightmare as possible. My pulse roared in my ears as I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. The keys trembled in my grasp, but I managed to shove one into the ignition, twisting it with a sharp click. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as the car lurched forward. Gravel spat out from under the wheels as I sped down the road, my eyes glued to the foggy path ahead. I could barely see through the mist, which seemed thicker now, like a living thing trying to swallow me whole. The house disappeared behind me, fading into the swirling fog as I drove. I didn't dare glance at the rearview mirror. The memory of what I had seen there earlier still burned in my mind. All I wanted was to make it back to the city, back to the safety of familiar streets and lights. The road stretched on, each second an eternity as I focused on keeping the wheel steady. My mind replayed the events of the night in disjointed flashes, the strange man with the unnatural smile, the shifting fog, the passenger who shouldn't exist. None of it made sense, and I couldn't let my thoughts linger too long, or I'd spiral into panic. Minutes passed like hours, the fog slowly thinning out as I neared the city limits. The sight of distant streetlights, dim and hazy through the mist, brought a glimmer of hope. I wasn't free yet, but at least I was moving away from that house, that darkness. I eased my grip on the wheel as the city finally came into full view. The glow of the neon signs and streetlights felt almost comforting, even though the city was still eerily quiet. I pulled into an empty gas station parking lot, my hands shaking as I put the car in park. I leaned back, taking in deep breaths to steady myself. "It's over," I muttered, wiping sweat from my forehead. My heart was still hammering, but at least I was away from that place. I closed my eyes, trying to erase the image of that decaying face in the back seat. It had to be over. I was back in the city, surrounded by light and the faint hum of civilization. But even as I sat there, the cold sweat on my skin refused to fade. With a deep breath, I opened my eyes and looked at the rearview mirror. Nothing but an empty back seat stared back at me. I let out a sigh of relief, my heart rate finally starting to slow. I reached for my phone to call it a night, deciding I was done with this shift. Just as I unlocked the screen, a new notification popped up. A ride request. The pickup location made my stomach drop. It was the same isolated house I'd just fled from. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, the address glowing ominously. Without a second thought, I shut off the phone and tossed it onto the seat beside me. "That's it," I muttered, starting the engine. "I'm done." I drove off, vowing to never work as a taxi driver again. Some fares just weren't worth the cost.